Good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm Morgan Bennett, Director of Member Engagement at SoCal Grantmakers. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining from the ancestral lands of the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. On behalf of Philanthropy California, I'm delighted to welcome you to this session, Emerging Initiatives to Build Equitable, Affordable Housing. This session is part of the Philanthropy California Learning Series for institutional and individual impact investors, sponsored by and partnering with RBC Global Asset Management. For those who don't know, Philanthropy California is a partnership of Northern California Grantmakers, SoCal Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. Our combined network of 700 plus philanthropic members share the common goal of building and sustaining thriving communities, for which equitable and affordable housing is essential. According to a 2017 USC study, 53% of California renters are considered rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their monthly household income on rent and utilities. Over the last decade, average rents have steadily increased. Inflation-adjusted wages have mostly remained stagnant, and the supply of affordable housing has dramatically decreased. And since the pandemic, the percentage of rent-burdened Californians has most certainly increased. While the state's housing affordability crisis is decades in the making, we are now at a tipping point to take the steps necessary to turn the tide, including Governor Newsom's recent California Comeback Plan, which includes historic budget investments in affordable housing. We're excited and honored to have experts and practitioners in the field with us today to share strategies to increase affordable housing supply, the role of private capital to pilot development solutions, unlock financing, and change policies that inhibit housing, and ways to ensure equitable benefits for communities disproportionately experiencing the impact of the state's housing crisis, such as essential workers and BIPOC communities. Before we begin, let's review a few housekeeping items. First, the session is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording afterwards. We'll have time for dialogue with our speakers at the end of the session, but if you have questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat box. At the end of the session, we hope you'll share your feedback on a 3-question poll, which will help us improve future programs. We have a great panel today, and our speakers' bios will be dropped into the chat for you to explore. But now I will turn this conversation to Brian Fairhurst to share a few remarks on behalf of RBC Global Asset Management. Brian.
Thank you for that wonderful intro, Morgan. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, I guess, almost. We're really excited to be having this final webinar in our 2021 series on back-to-back years of partnership with Philanthropy California. And if I look back over the webinars over the past 2 years and the global events, all I can say is what a wild ride it's been. I mean, who knew over the past 2 years we'd be all forced to learn the Greek alphabet with 30 named tropical storms in the Atlantic in 2020, an unprecedented number requiring 6 Greek alphabet letter named hurricanes. And now in 21, with our 13th known variant of the COVID-19 with Omicron. It's just a little bit insane. But closer to home, and maybe in a less exotic fashion, we have this pernicious, non-ending crisis with affordable housing and homelessness. And if you think about California itself, it's an amazing place, and it's a place of extremes. I think about just the amazing geography when I drive through the state. We've got the highest point, Mount Whitney, in the lower 48 states. So the highest point in the continental United States at 14,505 feet, only 80 miles away from the lowest point in the United States, Badwater Basin at 282 feet below sea level, 80 miles away. Also, by the way, the hottest recorded temperature on Earth in Death Valley. So we are a place of extremes within close proximity. And I think that's a really interesting analog to the challenge we face for affordable housing and homelessness. We are the largest state on a GDP basis by a mile. Our GDP this year of roughly 3.2 billion is almost the same amount as the next 2 states, Texas and New York combined. And yet, when you look at the unhoused population, over 161,000 people in California, that's 28% of the nationwide total for homelessness. And if you really think about that proximity problem, in the LA Metro and San Francisco Bay Areas, we have great extreme homeless populations located in very close proximity to extreme pockets of wealth. So it's a unique challenge, and I think it's really fitting that we're finishing the webinar series this year on this important topic. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ron Homer. He is the Chief Impact Strategist for RBC Global Asset Management. He's been tackling this issue his entire adult life. He's a fascinating individual, and I think he'll really help us navigate an interesting conversation today. Ron, please take it away.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the members of Philanthropy California and to all who's chosen to spend a late morning, early afternoon on this important topic. As Brian mentioned, I've been involved in housing issues since 1969 when I first went into banking. And to put that in perspective, 1968 was the year that the first national fair housing legislation was passed, the Fair Housing Bill of 1968. But also to put it in perspective, that legislation was designed to end discrimination and segregation in housing throughout the US. And we're still struggling with the aftermath of that to achieve that goal. But really much of the housing policy in the United States was developed during the New Deal, when the population was actually much broader, suffering from some of the things that Brian mentioned that have happened over the last couple of years and built up, as Morgan stated, over the past decades. So in 1934, in the middle of the New Deal in the Great Depression, the National Housing Act was established, and it established the Federal Housing Administration, which was designed to help developers develop low-cost housing and help homeowners buy housing, that low-cost housing, at low interest rates. And it was a great program. If you look at what FHA did from its inception in 1934 through the Depression, all the way up to post-World War II, it really helped lay the groundwork for the development of our suburbs, for large production of housing, making housing almost like production of automobiles. It opened up the door for increased rates of home ownership. And that, along with the Federal Highway Bill and other things, established a good part of the infrastructure that we know both in California and the East Coast and throughout the Midwest. So there's only one problem with that program. It's a really successful program, but built into that program, it discriminated and encouraged segregated housing, mostly discriminating towards African Americans at the time. So built into FHA, while people were fleeing inner cities and urban areas to suburbs and getting low-cost housing, the African Americans very often, even by either by actual law or by regulation, weren't allowed to move into those areas. And to the extent that they wanted to buy the housing that whites were leaving behind, they couldn't qualify for mortgages because it was considered unfinancial to invest in areas that were predominantly Black because the values would be dropping. So that backdrop in the 1968, we've been struggling with the legacy of those housing policies since then. Unfortunately, since the 1968, the US and nationally has not really had a sustainable and uniform housing policy. Much of our housing policies have been delegated to states and local municipalities. And the amount of support from the federal government has actually declined steadily since 1968. And this at a time where there's a growing need for for increased production, supply, and access. So I think today a couple of things are happening. One, the growing demographic changes in the country will necessitate some accommodation and some way to accommodate the increased browning of America. It's one of the critical issues I think that the U.S. has to deal with over the next decade or so. Secondly, this again is beginning to impact all Americans, not just those that were left out from the previous policies. And so there's a real opportunity. And we're beginning to see more support from the federal government, particularly through some of the legislation that was passed to remedy some of the economic ills of the pandemic. State and local municipalities are going to have some more resources to deal with this issue than they have in the past. So I think against this background, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Each has been involved in addressing this issue directly. They've developed models which they believe will help sustain and produce effective change. And I'd like, as we have this conversation, to think about what got us here and how these models can be maybe the bedrock for a more national and sustainable policy. So first, I'd like to start with Deborah Nguyen, who really likes to be Debbie. So with Debbie, you've actually, as I mentioned before, when the National Housing Act and the Public Housing Act of 1937 were established, it was really targeted to working class people, to workers. It wasn't considered a subsidy or I mean, it wasn't considered a poor people's program. And you're bringing that back with your work. So maybe you can share with our audience what you're doing, why you think it's important, and what gap it's filling.
Yeah, I'd love to. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, as Ron said, I am focusing on, there's a lot of terms for it. Some people call it workforce. I call it missing middle. I'm looking at the gap between subsidized housing and market rate, because as Ron said, you know, when the IRS and the tax codes and all of that were changed, 80% AMI wasn't that far away from market. Now it's massive. That leap, that gap is so huge. In some instances here in San Diego, that delta is about $500 a month, which a lot of families can't afford. So they're staying in subsidized housing. So I approach this from, I call it 3 legs of the stool. I started as a banker for affordable housing developers. And then I actually went into real estate development as an affordable housing developer. And then I went to government. And I consider the finance development and government aspects the 3 primary drivers of housing production. And when I was at the Housing Commission here in San Diego, I noticed that our portfolio of about 4,000 units became 100% occupied. And the bigger tell for me was that the turnover rate was traditionally 3 or 4 years. Somebody would stay in subsidized housing. By the time I left after 9 years, the average was 10 years. People were staying in subsidized housing, foregoing promotions because they didn't want to incur that extra $500-600 a month in rent to move into market rate housing. And so what I work on is augmenting government's work. I believe that government plays a very good and strong role in the 0 to 80% AMI range. And when I was at the Housing Commission, somebody told me that government had failed us by not building enough housing. I look at it as government has its hands full. There's not enough money, not enough subsidies. It's complicated to go through the public process to compete for the tax credits and bonds. I think it's private sector's time to jump in and pick up that 80 to 120% range and build housing to that demographic.
So very good. One thing before we go to our other speakers, I'd ask, you talked about government and its role in subsidization. One of the things I think we ought to recognize from the beginning, that all housing is subsidized, starting with the tax code and the deductibility for mortgage interest.
That's true.
As well as all the infrastructure and all the amenities that are put in to make communities more attractive and to increase the value. So I think in talking about equitable, affordable housing, we need to recognize that you're absolutely right. It's the private sector that's going to make the ultimate difference, but government and philanthropy can play roles in supporting that private sector investment.
That's true. So I created the Middlemarch Fund, and essentially what it does is it asks our regional leaders, our employers who are suffering because we can't attract or retain talent, our philanthropists, and our social impact investors to invest in housing in the middle income. And you get a lower return than traditional equity investors. But what it does is it creates deed restricted middle income housing. So a regulatory agreement goes on and keeps the units between 80 and 120% for 30 years. So it's a voluntary deed restriction on subsidized housing, not government mandated. It's San Diego saying, you know what, we haven't built enough housing. And if we don't deed restrict these units, they're going to creep up into an extremely high rental rate in no time at all. So this is my attempt to bring the private sector into investing in our own backyard, in our community, for our families, for our mental health, our physical health, the climate, and our financial health, and hoping that people can spend less on rent and save for home ownership. So that's what my approach is.
So Martin Milotto from Solar Impact, you actually use government programs to develop and build housing in critically underserved areas. And so maybe you could share with us what you've done and how you see that your strategies are playing out in the future and where it fits into the current crisis.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ron, Debbie, and the Philanthropy of California organization for hosting this. It's such a relevant topic. And I think I'm Martin Milotto, the CEO of Solar Impact. We actually don't use government subsidies. We don't. I have spent many years trying to understand LIHTC and tax credits, and I still can't figure them out. So maybe we just either are not smart enough or we just need to keep studying. So we're a private developer using private capital to build housing, affordable housing, primarily workforce housing in Black and Brown communities, specifically in Southern California, but we're beginning to look at a number of interesting projects in Northern California. I think I'd start by saying a few things. The first is, we've always held onto the belief that, we've got to give our investors market returns to be able to scale the business. It's never been sustainable to me to have concessionary returns. And so we believe we can do that with market rate returns without government subsidies. And I know a lot of people are scratching their heads, but we've been doing this for the last 14 years. We started in South Central, focused on South Central, Watts and Compton. When I started doing this at the very early stages, we were focused on rehabbing tough buildings and preserving affordable housing. And that has been certainly a good but challenging business because you inherit all the sins of the past. But that being said, we are now on our fourth fund, and our first two funds had around 1,500 units. These were all naturally occurring affordable housing in what others consider to be tough communities. We thought that these were stigmatized communities, and communities like South Central Watson Compton that had been historically overlooked and underinvested in. And quite frankly, because of that, you ended up having good real estate opportunities relative to the yields and relative to what you could earn. It did require a determined social impact strategy. And that for us meant really being able to work very closely with the community that we were investing in, but also working with about 40 nonprofit partners. We've built those relationships brick by brick, but those 40 plus nonprofit partners end up providing wraparound services to our tenants that would be beyond our capabilities, our business model. But those are very symbiotic relationships because all of those organizations are desperate for housing and are desperate for landlords that want to work closely with them to address the needs of the tenant population. Our last two funds have moved into development. And so when I looked at our Fund 1 and Fund 2 portfolios, while we had 1,500 units, we had rehabbed about 50% of those. We hadn't added one unit to the housing stock of Los Angeles, and that wasn't good enough. And so in 2019, we were able to take advantage of the Opportunity Zone legislation, which is certainly a government subsidy. And we were able to take advantage of that to continue to build affordable housing in Black and Brown communities, leveraging some of the OZ benefits and delivering market returns. Our most recent fund, which was a 2021 fund, which we call specifically the Black Impact Fund, which scares some institutional investors, like help us understand exactly the thesis. But it's really that we continue to focus exclusively on predominantly Black and Brown communities. We also have a non-OZ fund, and are anticipating in that fund building around 4,000 units. A significant portion of those are covenanted affordable for 55 years. But we also believe that the communities that we invest in want mixed income housing. They want other amenities. And so while folks tend to focus almost disproportionately on gentrification, I often say the opposite of gentrification is economic segregation, which is all the poor people are put in one part of town. And the folks that have lived in these communities for decades don't want that. They want affordable housing, but they also want mixed use and other types of housing, and they want to interact with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So with that, I'll pause there and come back if there are additional questions.
Sure. So I have one question. In what percentage of your of the tenants have housing vouchers, or are they all paying from their own resources?
Yeah, so we are one of the largest, if not the largest, Section 8 landlord in Los Angeles. So about 50% of our tenants get Section 8 vouchers. So from that standpoint, we're certainly, feel that's a very effective program. About 50% are generally market payers. And so there is a combination of subsidies in that regard.
Right, that's where I was confused when.
Understood.
Also, then, how are you able to, given the fact that a brick is the same price, whether it's in a large, high-cost suburb or a predominantly Black area, how are you able to build new quality housing at affordable prices?
Our view is it's the unleashing of innovation and free enterprise and a ruthless focus on cost and driving down every aspect of that. I think one of the unintended consequences of some of the government programs like Triple H, Measure H, and LIHTC ends up really driving up costs between consultants and financing fees and complexity and legal fees. And we are able to sustainably build at $225,000 a unit. Again, folks scratch their heads. These are high quality, affordable housing units in low-income communities at $225,000. If we have to add extensive parking, it usually drives that up to closer to $250,000. But that's simply a combination of a ruthless focus on size, scalability, replication, and simplification. So we found a sweet spot in the market. We try to standardize everything across our buildings and to drive down costs, because we do a lot of small, medium-sized projects, typically under 100 units. We have a lot of predictability in our purchasing of materials and what have you. And so, our view is that we're also a for-profit company that has to watch every penny, nickel and dime, and therefore that ultimately drives to being able to push on contractors, subcontractors, manufacturers, material suppliers to drive down that cost.
So on one other question on, and I'm not sure in California, but on the East Coast, one of the largest landholders in cities happens to be government, whether it's land that they use for transportation, took for eminent domain for a variety of reasons, or public land that they use for one purpose that they no longer need. Has California adapted, and would it help if they provided access to this public land to developers of affordable housing at the lower, at the prices which would bring down the land costs?
It's a great question. I think that, whenever government provides the land, and we've looked at a number of those situations, it adds so much complexity, bureaucracy, and other requirements that you almost end up being better off buying the land in a commercial arm's length transaction. So we've tried to do it, at least in California, it's incredibly bureaucratic and complex. And I think that what would make a much more material impact is really the predictability and the assurance in the permitting and expediting process. As many folks know, I've spoken to dozens of institutional investors and that say, we don't want to build in California. It's too risky, it's too costly, and so on. And that really is a tremendous disservice to addressing this problem. We cannot address the problem of the affordability housing crisis without significant institutional investors on the private side. We've been out raising our fourth fund, and I've learned that the golden rule is those with the gold make the rules. And so the issue is really attracting large-scale institutional investors into this market, and getting them to understand how operators like us, developers like us, manage risk. But there's a lot the government can do, but government land would not be in my top 5 or top 10 things. It would be a lot of tort reform. It would be a lot of simplification of the building process, building permitting process, and in many respects, staying out of the way and letting developers really be able to have predictability of certain aspects of the process. But again, in many cases, especially in LA, we've gotten tremendous support from the locals, and the local council members and the state resources.
And you also mentioned your focus on costs. So in addition to land, there's the labor cost. And so one of the, I think, issues with some of the government financed is that it often requires union labor or prevailing. Do you use union labor, and what type of, are you subject to prevailing wage?
That's a good question, Ron. Because we don't use government land, government land, we're not subject to prevailing wage. We are subject to fair practices and fair wages, and we, very, very happy to do that. But we typically use commercial contractors and subcontractors to do the development. It's certainly, we have to compete with market and luxury housing, as well as, the explosion of single family housing in LA and in Southern California. As you can imagine, it's not easy, but I think there are ways to offset that. And a lot of that comes again with scale. Because we are a very large developer in our markets, we can have a lot more influence. We're not Amazon or Walmart, so to speak, but we can give our partners, our vendors, predictability of the number of jobs they'll have each year. We do a lot of the procurement ourselves at volume. with national providers to drive down the cost. So if I told you our pricing on paint with Behr paint, if I told you our pricing on faucets, even on lumber, we bought 6 months supply of lumber and rented warehouses to store that in, not because we were so smart to figure out that lumber prices would spike, although maybe when, I should say, since it's being recorded, we actually had that brilliant insight. We did not. But it allowed us, because we saw we needed to stockpile for multiple projects at the same time, we decided to buy in bulk, and that translated into material savings on our next 4 or 5 projects. Maybe we just got lucky, but I think those are capitalism being applied to solve problems that in many respects capitalism created. And one of the things I always say is, look, these are income inequality, and the lack of affordable housing, especially in California, was created because of capitalism, and so we need to find ways to use capitalism to solve these problems with a very, decided social impact construct.
Well, there's no question about it. Actually, if you read a Californian book, Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, it talks about how the bedrock of capitalism for some excluded capitalism for others, and so I agree. So and I'll come back. I will come back later on to talk to you about the permitting, and probably also with Debbie too. But Michael, you're with self-help. I have a real sweet spot for self-help credit union and small banks, because I ran a CDFI bank, one of the first CDFI banks, for 13 years. And it's now in California, One United Bank, but I founded that. So I know from self-help, you're on the ground, you see these communities, you focus on areas where there's a great deal of need. Can you tell us from your perspective what you're seeing, how you're responding, and how a group like this can be helpful?
I'm Michael Chow, Director of Real Estate Development California, based in Oakland. I'm very glad, happy to be here, joining Ron, Deborah, Martin, this idea of creative financing and how private capital could really bring about change around affordable housing supply, more equitable housing, and really, I think what California needs is new solutions. To Ron's earlier question about government land and Martin's responses, I mean, government has tried to do that via ground leases. But because of the layers of impediments that come with that, it's made looking at alternative approaches seem more viable. The areas I'm focusing on, really driven by the space I came from, which was nearly 20 years of developing tax credit projects, and I'm now in this space really focused around where I see need, which is what I broadly bucket around preservation. I use that broadly. It kind of captures kind of non-LIHTC existing housing, both NOAA housing, community land trust, and kind of the smaller nonprofits who don't have the capacity, both organizationally and financially, to really bring about more affordable housing in the neighborhoods. So that's been a key area of need that I've been focusing. Also because we are a credit union with a footprint up and down California, continue to expand, and also looking at the intersection of kind of community facilities and neighborhood preservation, and linkages to creating more affordable housing. We are looking at a project right now in Oakland, really looking at a new branch, a new office, but that also comes with opportunity to do housing as a third phase. So looking at those intersections, especially where we self-help own land, we have a number of projects, properties that, because we own, I think we have one of the biggest variables to development, which is the land. That's allowed us to kind of look at facilitating revitalization projects above and beyond just our branch footprint. And then Not to kind of repeat Martin and Debbie's great points around funds and attracting institutional dollars. I think where those dollars could be focused around is kind of circumventing the impediments that government funding has kind of created, systems and regulations that really make it not only difficult for new affordable housing projects, but access to housing. The wait list is really scary. That wait list is repetitive. It's a very difficult process to even access housing. And then I think I found, what I realized after so many years of development affordable housing is we're not going to be able to build our way out of affordable housing. I think where private capital or CDFIs can make an impact is circumventing some of the existing systems and focusing directly on making impacts to the low-income residents themselves. By this, I mean kind of creating economic pathways that incentivize them, support them to be able to feel comfortable to go to the middle-income housing, the workforce housing, without feeling like they're going to have to make some massive trade-offs in order to do that. So I think that's where private capital can make an impact, and where I think I saw somewhere that buildings don't create change, people do, and I think it's about getting private capital and some of the folks who have been impediments, but also largely drivers, government, providing affordable housing to kind of look at themselves, look at the systems that they've put up around barriers, and really seeing if we could find ways to directly impact, again, the residents who are living in affordable housing and helping them to leave affordable housing. And we haven't even covered the intersection of homeownership housing, because I think that is this opportunity, this economic pathway can also lead to, folks leaving affordable housing, but then creating slots for other families who have been waiting, who aren't ready to go to homeownership, but need stabilized affordable housing.
Yeah, well, because you've all talked about the use of private investment capital. Actually, the largest source of potential private capital is the ability of residents to borrow money and invest in their own homes, which they will eventually pay back from their own resources and income. And so, do any of you have thoughts on how your strategy can help encourage home ownership and develop product that would not only provide rental housing, but more opportunities for those who are in existing rental housing to move out of rental housing to own their own homes? Yes, Michael.
A thought to that question, if I heard it correctly, is for example, I'm working with some of the community land trusts, and a key component about community land trusts is this idea of limited equity, stewardship, essentially learning to be what I think about preparing to be a homeowner is kind of how I think about the work of land trusts. And maybe we could pair financing with clear benchmarks around financial capability, financial empowerment, and then creating the new systems and pathways for them to start at a place like a community land trust, get ready, and then provide them with the kind of financial and financial capability supports that allow them to graduate and leave affordable housing. So that's one example I thought about.
Debbie?
We have two programs that we're piloting next year. One of them is called Pathways to Home Ownership. The vast majority of our tenants will likely be renters for the majority of their life, unfortunately, and we want to encourage them to look at alternatives to that. So that program for qualified tenants, and it's a fairly stringent qualification, you've got to have continuous employment for at least 12 months and then continue that. But it's really taking a portion of their rent and putting it into an escrow so that they use that towards a savings. So the program at a very high level would be us as the landlord would put 10% of their rent in an escrow account. If they're paying $1,200, $120 a month, they would need to match that with $120 of their own savings. And then a third-party nonprofit would match that with $120 per month. And over the course of 3 to 5 years, they can earn somewhere between $30,000 to $50,000 towards the down payment for a home. And obviously giving them the financial literacy, the tools of credit repair and credit maintenance throughout that, so that they come out of that 3 to 5 year period really well prepared. And we have a number of banks as partners that will provide them that 5% down loans for their first home. So that's part A. For us, part B is, we continue to believe that we can drive down the cost of single family homes. Similarly, we have a couple of projects where we're building 3 to 4 bedroom townhome style apartments, and we look like we will end up somewhere around $375,000 to $400,000 a door. So we will pilot a program next year where we will do that and then make that available for sale to members of the community. And we're thinking nurses, firefighters, police officers for at cost. So for us, it's a matter of really demonstrating the program works, and hopefully then other developers beg, borrow, and steal those best ideas and continue to scale them. So I think those are two aspects that we have currently in the works.
Debbie, I think you had a...
Yeah, I just had a point on that. And Martin, if you can build cheaper, great. Yes, there's a lot of innovative materials being used. We've heard of container housing and modular housing. From a lot of the developers I've heard, those prices go up as the demand rises, or the inventory is compromised because of the supply chain right now. I want to see more affordable housing construction built, but the way I look at it is you pay for the land, you pay for the hard costs, which is the materials, and then you pay for the labor. And traditionally, those three don't go down. You're not going to get the land cheaper unless you've got a land trust or somebody who's willing to take a hit or donate it. But the employers, the employment, the laborers, and the materials, they tend to go up. So what I focus on is the capital stack, getting a cheaper source of money in the deal. So there are a lot of rules and regs that the banks have to go through in order to get their money out. And I saw that especially with first-time home buyers and lower income home buyers, potential home buyers, they wouldn't get the attractive interest rates that people who aren't as or are more well off. So that compromises their ability to get a good loan. And I also believe that government has a role here to play in helping this, and philanthropy. So I see the ability for us to push more on getting more philanthropic organizations focused on home ownership, and exactly what Martin and Mike were saying, support these homeowners. And I think that banks can play a role by helping out a little bit more, taking maybe a higher loan to value or allowing a lower interest rate to support these folks as they enter home ownership, because that's where they're going to build equity. There are some first-time homebuyer programs with public organizations, but the homeowner doesn't benefit from the entire equity. They have to give some of that back, or it stays in the deal when or if they choose to sell. That defeats the purpose. It's the equity that enables families to use it to send their kids to college or to get out of the cycle they're in. So I think there's opportunities for philanthropy and banks to support home ownership a little more than they're doing.
No, I would agree wholeheartedly. There's actually a legislation that had been in place in the 2008 recovery plan, and then it sunset in 2010. But the House has already passed this bill to provide $15,000 to first-time home buyers. So that's in the Senate, could be voted on next week, next month, maybe never. And that's one aspect. But I think you're right. Philanthropy could play a role in providing down payment assistance programs, et cetera. Our fund, somewhat of an advertisement, we have run funds that provide 100% targeted to people who make below 80% of median. In most of our funds, we have a couple SMSAs that are 120. And those mortgages outperform generic mortgages. So you don't have to, there's no subsidy involved. It's a market rate return. They actually outperform. And you have these huge, and I take some issue in that there are plenty of tools to accommodate that. You have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac who have had huge government subsidies, including being saved in 2008, 2009, and they're there to be used. And they have a mandate to provide affordable home ownership, et cetera. They just need to encourage the banks to use those programs and to encourage community residents. And I think where philanthropy can play a place is that I'm not sure, Martin, that there's anyone in America who couldn't ultimately qualify to own a home with the proper support and the proper, I don't buy into that premise to begin with. But part of the philanthropic effort should be around education on how to use the system. You know, Walter Wriston, I go back long enough that when Citibank was going outside the US and starting to develop its international presence, they asked Walter Wriston, how do you choose which areas you go to expand? And he had a simple answer. He says, you know, capital, because you all stress capital and capitalism. He said, capital goes where it's invited and it stays where it's welcome, which means that one of the roles of government is to incent capital to go into some of these areas. The other role is for that capital to make a good return. And so I'm convinced that many of the people who are now in rental properties could be homeowners. There's a lot of underutilized homes that need renovation. So I also think within this bill, there is a program that would extend the low-income housing tax credit program, which I agree, Martin, wholeheartedly just encourages increased costs. But let's assume that you gave that same tax credit to someone who bought a house and renovated it and bought it in an area where they couldn't get the mortgage that they needed because the appraisal wasn't right. But with the renovations, it would appraise properly. So there's a tax credit. So I think one of the things I would encourage the audience, as well as a practitioner, is to look at ways in which we can use philanthropy and existing government programs or tweaking some existing government programs to welcome private capital and to help it get the returns that it needs to sustain it being there.
Yeah, I think, Ron, I'd echo that. I think we're probably in violent agreement on many aspects. I mean, I think a lot of our comments across the panelists have been about how government should do more. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of government folks on this dialed into this call, so we can talk about sort of, hey, listen, we'd love for government to come on board and do this. Look, we've spent a lot of time talking to the nation's largest and California's largest foundations about investing in low-income communities, supporting Black and Brown communities. And I will tell you, without being overly controversial, a lot of them are like, ooh, seems very risky. and again, without naming names, folks have gone, look, you know what? I got to support KKR, Blackstone, BlackRock, because Steve Schwarzman really needs our support. So I mince no words when I say we need to do more. This is the housing issue, the homeless issue. It's a crisis, and it's a crisis from every aspect of California's economy. I recently saw a study that California is adding 2.5 jobs for every housing unit, right? And so that's completely unsustainable. But I would challenge the folks to really go back and think about sort of how they look at these metrics. You know, I hear very often, well, it presents headline risk. Well, you know, working with poor folks presents headline risk. It's a tough, thankless, tireless, you know, focus. But if you do it with responsibly and you know, really work with a lot of grassroots organizations, it can be done. So I think that, you know, I just want to make sure that we're not passing the buck here and waiting for the government cavalry to show up, because I think we could, you know, we can and we all should be doing a lot more.
If I could bolt on to that, Ron, if you don't mind, if I follow up on what Martin says, he's exactly right. You know, government is cautious for a reason. They're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. It's taxpayer money. And so if they're going to spend it, they have to go through a thoughtful process, and that translates to time, and time is money. So government isn't going to be.
But Debbie, let me just break. What could be more thoughtful than building community, establishing opportunity for people, establishing ownership, et cetera?
Doing it the wrong way and being
the
on the
role of government is to provide provide living conditions and livability within its communities. I only raise this because there's a lot of support at the mayor's level, at the governor's level, and even at the federal level in certain areas around affordable housing. But I think they aim too low. They get let off the hook too easily. And it's almost treated like this is a problem that can't be scalable. It's too risky. It can't be dealt with. And as long as we have that mentality, we're never going to solve this problem.
I don't disagree with you. There are, in San Diego, our mayor has created task forces and done, like, government subsidy can equate to permit expediting, fee deferrals and waivers, density bonuses, those kinds of things. We're seeing that in San Diego. We're seeing political leadership here trying to help. I look at it as we need to get out of the way of the developers and let them build, because they are the ones who are going to build us out of this crisis. And we need to help them with every tool in the toolbox to do that.
So I'll tell you a story that helped inform me. Back in, believe it or not, under Richard Nixon, George Romney, who ran American Motors, started something at HUD called Operation Breakthrough. And his idea was to, as you said, Martin, is that because housing's cottage industry and it's small and it's wide, to build scale, and that to mandate that anyone who was building public housing or using federal dollars would have to use these production facilities. And he created a couple of companies that would actually create low-cost housing in a factory, modular, could buy on scale, et cetera. It was a great program. It all fell apart because I was the group that had to clean up the pieces. It fell apart because while they manufactured housing and they had the federal support, it got hung up in the permitting and the NIMBY types. So they could never establish the production capability in the online. So my only point, and we're nearing the end, is that I don't think any one strategy is going to be the solution. That we need education with the community to how to access home ownership and use some existing programs to take care of the properties that they rent in. We need government support for permitting and to reduce some of the costs. But we also need advocates that are thoughtful and think through, so that we have, one of the things I've seen, and I've been guilty of it myself, is that we have all these idiosyncratic solutions and everybody thinks that their idiosyncratic solution is nirvana, but they're not scalable, they're not sustainable, and they don't do this. And this is too big of a issue to solve, at least on the high end, with one-off solutions. It's going to have to be something that is affordable, scalable, and sustainable. So with that, I applaud all of the work of the panelists. I wish you success in continuing. I hope that your success is so great that it does become part of a model, that it wakes up the Fannie Mae's and the Freddie Mac's and the FHA's and the local permitters and the philanthropists who want to do something about housing, et cetera, and they seek out ways to partner with you and to create success, because your success will mean success for America and California too, which is part of it.
Thank you for having us, Ron.
Yeah, thank you all.
And yes, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, and thank you so much, Ron, for facilitating this conversation. Really hope that you have all learned as much as I have. Left me with a lot to think about today and some really exciting opportunities on the horizon. Just wanted to remind everyone, please take 30 seconds to complete the poll that is going to pop up on your screen. Your feedback is so incredibly helpful in shaping future content around this topic that is not going away and something we're going to want to continue covering. So please share your thoughts with us there. Also just wanted to remind you, a recording will be forthcoming along with a follow-up email from this program. Also just wanted to say thanks again for making time to participate in this conversation. Wanted to wish everyone who is celebrating safe, festive holidays, stay well, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Thank you, everyone.